Hey everyone, today we're going through the lore and history of the fall of Commander Farsight and how the Tau Empire tore their hero down from the pedestal they put him on. We'll be going through how Commander Farsight learned of what the Ethereals were keeping from him and from their population. We'll be going through the planets that he led and created outside the bounds of the Tau Empire, and his return from that exile to fight the Hive Fleet of the Tyranids. To me, this was the more interesting chapter of Farsight's long life, so hopefully you enjoy. As always, before we begin, I'd like to say a thank you to our patrons and our YouTube members who help keep this content going. If you'd like to become a patron, you can find a link in the description below, or if you'd like to become a YouTube member, you can find a link in the homepage of our YouTube channel. And if you'd like to listen to audio only, you can find the Lawkeeper's Librarian on Spotify.
In the long aftermath of the Damocles War, while the Earth Caste went about the business of cataloguing the wreckage the Imperium had left behind, and the Water Caste went about the equally long business of explaining to the populace what had just happened to them, the senior councils of the Ethereals turned their attention to the matter of morale. The Tau Empire had survived its first encounter with the Imperium of mankind, and it had survived well. But the survival had cost something less easily measured than ships or warriors. For the great unspoken assumption upon which Tau confidence had always rested, the assumption that their cause and their methods were naturally and self-evidently superior to those of any species they might encounter, had been rather seriously bruised. The Imperium had been brutal. The Imperium had been wasteful. But the Imperium had also, in its dreadful way, been effective. And a great many Tau had seen things during those months that no amount of reassuring Water Caste speech could undo. Aunver, who understood such things very well, called the period the Nontka, which is to say the time of questioning, and he set himself to putting it right. What he needed, he decided, was a hero, not a new one. There was no time to grow a new one, but the hero the Empire already possessed, raised at last to the full scale that the moment required. And so the propaganda machinery of the Water Caste was turned upon Commander Farsight with a thoroughness it had not previously been turned upon any single warrior in living memory. Statues of him appeared in every major battle dome and pod complex and naval harbor across the worlds of the First Sphere. Holographic recordings of his victories at Arkanasha and Dalith were circulated on every public broadcast network the Empire possessed. Fire warriors of every rank acquired small images of him, sometimes carried alongside images of Aunvar and the late Aunwë themselves, which was a juxtaposition that would have struck any Tau of an earlier generation as faintly improper, and which was permitted now because the moment seemed to require it. Children learned his name before they learned the names of their own septs. Old veterans spoke of him in tones they had previously reserved only for Puretide. For Farsight himself, who was a private man and who had never quite known what to do with public affection in any quantity, the experience was bewildering and, in a way, exhausting. He was greeted with the formal hunter's salute so many times in the course of an ordinary day that his arm began, by the second week, to ache from the constant returning of it, and he took to keeping the arm flexed against his side for as long as protocol allowed before bringing it up. He smiled politely at the small children who were brought to him for blessings he had never asked to be empowered to give. He sat through ceremonies of recognition that lasted entire afternoons. He bore it all because the Empire needed its hero, and because an ethereal master had asked him to bear it. But he did not in his heart much care for any of it, and he was glad when at last the great fleet was assembled and the order was given, to be returning to a place where the only people who knew his name were the warriors who had to follow him into battle. The fleet that gathered for what came to be called the Great Reclamation was the largest the Tau Empire had ever assembled. Battleships and escorts and war spheres, and the long, sleek shapes of the Manta destroyers, Grafpos tugs, and outrider patrols, and the great bulks of the colony ships, all of them gathered in such numbers above the worlds of the First Sphere that the assembling itself took weeks to complete. Anwei, in what would prove to be one of the last great speeches of his long life, sent the fleet on its way with the proper ceremonies. Farsight stood at his place of honor and watched the old ethereal speak, and listened to the cheering of the crowds, and felt somewhere beneath the ribs a small unease he could not entirely account for. The Empire was sending him out to do what the Empire had always done, which was to bring the light of the greater good to worlds that did not yet possess it. He was the one chosen to carry that light. He was, by every outward measure, a warrior at the very height of his powers, beloved of his people and trusted by his masters, and equipped with every resource the Empire could provide. There was no rational ground for the small unease. He noted it, and he set it aside, and he turned his attention to the work ahead. The crossing of the Gulf, which had once been a matter of considerable peril, was by then a routine, if still slightly uncomfortable affair, and the fleet emerged on the far side in good order and went immediately to work. The worlds that the Imperium had taken from the Tau in the early stages of the Damocles Crusade were for the most part garrisoned now only by planetary defense forces, the bulk of the Imperial military having been called away to fight the great alien menace that had appeared elsewhere in the sector, the tendrils of Hive Fleet Behemoth, whose assault upon the Imperium during precisely those years was a stroke of fortune for the Tau of an almost embarrassing magnitude. The defense forces were brave, and many of them were numerous, but they were not equipped to meet the fire cast in the open field, and Farsight, who had spent the long voyage poring over every scrap of recorded data the war on Dalith had produced, met them with the thoroughness of preparation. He had, during that crossing, done something rather extraordinary. He had taken the patterns of imperial behavior from the Damocles War, and he had turned them in his mind and looked at them from every angle, and he had reduced them at last to a kind of code, what he and his lieutenants came to call the human war schematic. It was not a perfect code, and it did not capture every variation that an actual human commander might produce on the field, but it captured enough. It was something close to a mathematical key for the predicting of what the armies of mankind would do, and it gave him, before each engagement, an advantage that the worlds he was reclaiming had no means of countering. He drew the Imperial garrisons out into the open with vanguard raids, and when the garrisons had committed themselves, he fell upon them from above with the killing strokes of the Montka, and he won, and he won, and he won again. World by world, the Damocles Gulf came back into the fold. The cheering across the Empire grew louder with every victory. The propaganda machinery hardly needed to do anything anymore, for the news of each new conquest carried itself. There is a sort of warning to be heard in the records of those years, if one knows how to listen for it, and it is the sort of warning that arises when a story is going almost too well. The history of the Reclamation reads, in places, like the history of a person at the very height of his powers, a man for whom every gamble pays out, and every plan unfolds as foreseen, and every enemy crumbles in the appointed manner. They are glorious to read. He was magnificent in those years. He was loved by his warriors, and admired by his peers, and fashioned, by the careful hands of the watercast, into something almost more than a man. And he was already, though he did not yet know it himself, walking towards the place where it would all begin to come apart. The reconquests of the 4 principal worlds upon the far side of the Gulf were bloody in the extreme, for those worlds had been longer in imperial hands and were defended with greater commitment than the outlying colonies. By the time the fleet reached the system that contained the last of those worlds, fewer than half of the original ships still flew, and Farsight felt every loss with the weight that a commander feels when he has personally known the names of those who are no longer present at the daily conferences. His ethereal advisors had by then made it quite clear that no further reinforcements would be forthcoming. The fleet had been given everything the Empire could afford to give it, and the rest of the work would have to be done with what remained. It was at this point, with a single world left to reclaim, and the formal completion of the Ethereal's commission almost in his grasp, that the long-range scans began to return information that no one in the fleet had been expecting. The asteroid belt to the east of the recaptured colonies, which had been more or less ignored during the rapid conquest of the inhabited worlds, was infested with orcs. Not a small infestation, not a passing nuisance. The drone scans, when they came back, showed an orc presence that stretched all the way into the next system, an orc empire, if the readings could be trusted, that had grown up in the long absence of any organized opposition, while the Imperium and the Tau had been busy with one another. Farsight read the reports in the silence of his command chamber. He read them again. He spent by some accounts the better part of a day in private meditation, which was longer than he was accustomed to spending on any single decision. And then he came up to the bridge of his flagship, and his officers turned to him, as they had turned to him countless times before. And he said the thing that would, in time, become one of the most quoted lines in the secret histories of the enclaves. "The destruction of the orcs," he said, "is a higher priority than concluding the reconquest." It was a single sentence, calmly delivered, and the officers who heard it did not for a moment quite understand what they had heard. The reconquest of Illuminus, the last world, the world whose subjugation would have closed out the Ethereal's commission with perfect tidiness and brought the whole expedition to its proper formal end, was to be set aside. The fleet would turn instead to the asteroid belt and the systems beyond it, and would pursue the Orc Empire wherever it led, and would not return to its assigned task until the Orcs had been destroyed. It was the first time in the entire long history of the Firecast's relationship with the Ethereal Council that a commander of any rank had directly disobeyed a standing order from that council. There had been circumventions before. There had been tactful interpretations of unclear instructions. There had been, as we have seen, the occasional small lie told for the sake of a friend. But this was something different. This was a senior commander of the Empire, in front of his officers, on the bridge of his own flagship, calmly setting aside a directive he had been given by the highest authority of his civilization, and substituting in its place a directive of his own. It was, by any honest reading, the moment at which the Farsight we have been following ceased to be a hero of the Empire in the ordinary sense, and began to be something else, something that the Empire did not yet have a word for, and would in time invent several uncomplimentary words to describe. He did not, of course, see the moment that way at the time. To him, the matter was straightforward. There was an Orc Empire on the fringe of Tau space, and Orc Empires, as he had learned at some considerable cost upon the dunes of Arkanasha, did not stay on fringes. They grew. They probed. They eventually came inwards, and when they came inwards they did so in the kind of numbers that turned biodomes into besieged islands and turned reclamation campaigns into rearguard actions for survival. The empire he loved was, by his lights, in danger, and the empire's appointed defenders were elsewhere, and there was no one else to do the work that needed doing. He gave the order. The fleet turned, and the long bright thread of his glory which had run unbroken from the snows of Mount Kanji to the cheering crowds of the First Sphere worlds, began to fray, very slowly, at the place where the order had been given. The ethereal advisors aboard his ship received the news with composure. They did not protest in the moment. They sent messages back across the gulf instead, to the councils on Viola, where the messages would be considered with all due deliberation. The deliberations would take some time. They would, in fact, take longer than anyone aboard the fleet would have predicted. By the time the councils on Viola had reached their conclusions about Commander Farsight and his sudden new war, the fleet would already have passed beyond the range of any communication beacon the Empire possessed, and the conclusions, when they were at last reached, would be conclusions about a man the Empire could no longer reach. He did not know any of this on the bridge that afternoon. He knew only that the orcs needed killing, and that he was the warrior best placed to kill them, and that the work was urgent. He turned to his aircast admiral and gave the orders for the new course. The bridge crew bent to their stations. The fleet wheeled in the dark and turned its prow towards the asteroid belt, and the long, terrible work of his last great campaign began. The asteroid belt that the Tau charts had marked as the Vorak was, by the time Farsight's fleet reached its outer edges, no longer really an asteroid belt at all. It had become something stranger. The long-range scans, when they came back from the forward drones, showed an arrangement of bodies in the void that did not correspond to anything in the normal catalogues of space. And the closer the fleet drew, the more peculiar the readings became, until at last the picture resolved itself into a truth that none of the senior officers had quite prepared themselves for. The asteroids of the Vorak were not hiding the Orc fleet. The asteroids were the Orc fleet. Each great pitted body of rock had been crusted over with sheets of scrap metal and studded with crude weaponry, and at the rear of each had been welded huge engines, and the whole assemblage of them hung in the dark like some long, terrible string of beads, a burning rosary of warships strung out across half a system and grinding their slow way towards the worlds the Tau had only just reclaimed. Farsight studied the symbols carved into the asteroid hulls with the attention he had brought to every campaign of his career, and within an evening he had matched them to records of an old incursion that had troubled the Sept worlds many years before. The greenskins had been driven off then. They had not, it seemed, been driven far enough. They had simply withdrawn to the fringes of Tau space, and they had waited there in malice for the moment when the defenders looked elsewhere. He gave the orders, and the fleet went to work, and the work, at first, went well. An admiral who had served at Farsight's side since the long aircast duels above Dalith brought his pilots into the engagement with the elegance of an aircast flotilla that had been preparing for precisely this kind of fight for years. The asteroid ships were enormous and crudely armed, and they could not turn quickly, and they had been built upon the assumption that no enemy would dare engage them at the close ranges where they were genuinely formidable. The Tau declined to make that assumption. They came in at long range, and they struck the engines, and they peeled away again before the asteroid ships could bring their guns to bear. And one after another the great clumsy vessels lost their motive power and drifted in the dark, smoking gently from 100 wounds and unable to reply. For weeks the fleet's progress could be tracked by the string of small fires it was leaving across the void behind it, each fire a dying orc ship that would in time burn itself out and become merely another piece of cold debris in the long catalogue of things that had been killed in those years. It was late in the campaign, when the work seemed almost done, that the news came up to Farsight's bridge that no commander ever wishes to hear about a friend. The admiral had been overseeing one of the final extermination strikes against a smaller cluster of asteroid ships when a hidden missile battery, concealed within the rock of one of the supposedly disabled hulls, and triggered by some Orc mechanism the scans had not detected, had fired its single salvo at his command vessel. The salvo had struck. The vessel had been lost with all hands. The admiral was dead. Farsight received the news in the standing manner appropriate to the receipt of such news on the bridge of a flagship. He did not sit down. He did not lean upon anything. His eyes narrowed very slightly, and the officers who knew him best, and there were not many such officers, for he had never been a man who let himself be easily known, saw the small tightening at the corners of his mouth that meant he was holding something quite carefully in place. He was silent for a long moment. He thanked the officer who had brought him the news. He bowed with the proper depth of formality in the direction of the stars where his old friend's vessel had been struck. He said that the campaign would continue. The Orcs would be pursued. Every last one of them would be put to the torch. And then he asked for leave to retire to his quarters for a short period of meditation. He came back out, by the records of the time, perhaps an hour later. There was no outward sign upon him of what had happened in that hour. There rarely was with him. But he gave the orders for the next phase of the campaign with a composure that several of his officers would later describe as having been, somehow, more level than was natural. The fleet pressed on. The hunt continued. The remaining asteroid ships were broken up one by one, and Farsight was the same methodical commander he had been the morning before. But the hour in his quarters had cost him something, and the cost would not be paid back. It never is, with such losses. It was during the closing weeks of the Vorak campaign that he began to understand that the foe he was fighting was not, after all, of quite the same kind as the Orcs of Arkunasha had been. The asteroid ships, when they were boarded for inspection, contained things that no Orc incursion ought to have contained. Captured Tau technology, repaired and modified and put back into Orcish service. Stockpiles of looted ammunition, arranged with something like an organized intelligence behind the arrangement. Charts that showed the locations of Tau colonies and the approach paths to them, plotted with a crude but recognizable accuracy. Somewhere within this Orc empire, Farsight came to realize there was an Orc who had been thinking, not in the slow, brutish way of the war bosses he had outwitted upon the dunes, but in something altogether closer to the way Farsight himself thought. A foe who studied, a foe who learned, a foe who had, perhaps, learned from the very campaign of Arkunasha itself, and who had been turning Farsight's old methods over in his mind and coming to conclusions of his own. The name attached to this Orc was, by some Orc joke that the Tau never entirely understood, Grog Iron Teeth. He was the war chief of a fortress rock called Alsanta, and he was, Farsight came to suspect, the architect of the asteroid fleet that the Tau had spent so long destroying. 2 great clusters of asteroid ships still survived. They were the largest of the original armada, and they had broken away from the Vorak as the rest of the fleet was being annihilated, and they were heading, on courses that had clearly been chosen with some care, towards 2 different worlds. The first cluster was bound for an artifact world called Arthas Moloch, of which little was known. The second cluster, which contained at its heart a single great dagger-shaped asteroid that the readings suggested was the largest vessel in the entire Orc fleet, was bound for the Tau-held world of Atari Vosges. Farsight thought about it for a long while. A flagship shaped like a weapon, he said at last, was the kind of vessel that would appeal to the vanity of an Orc warlord. He gave the order. The fleet turned towards Atari Vosges. Atari Vosges was a world of cities and gardens, settled in the second great sphere of Tau expansion, and the warriors who garrisoned it had been preparing their fleet to meet the incoming asteroid ships, as the Tau had always met such things, at long range, in clean engagements, before the enemy could close. They were still scrambling that fleet when Farsight's signal reached them, warning them that the orcs were not going to slow down upon entry. The orcs were going to land the asteroid ships. They were going to drive them into the planet itself with all the force the great crude engines could provide. The asteroids came down. They came down with a fury that the Tau of Atari Vo had not been prepared for, and the impacts of them across the main continent of Vohai snuffed out millions of lives in the seconds it took for each great rock to bury itself. The capital city, the white-walled jewel called Tau Rotasha, was struck almost dead center by the dagger ship. Of the city, when the dust cleared, there was nothing left. There was only a vast smoking crater where one of the most beautiful cities of the Empire had been, an hour before, full of light and water and the small ordinary lives of citizens who had been certain of the security of their world. The Tau of Atari Vo had hoped, in the desperate moments of waiting after the impacts, that the orcs themselves would have been killed by the violence of their own arrival. They had not been. The shield cores within each asteroid ship had held. The orcs came pouring out of the craters with a storm of crackling energy weapons and salvaged Tau guns, and the volume of fire that emerged from those craters was unlike anything Farsight had ever encountered in his long career of fighting greenskins. These were not the Dune children he had taught his cadres to break upon Arkanasha. These were orcs who had been taught, by the mind of their war chief, exactly how the Tau would respond to them, and exactly where the Tau would be vulnerable when they did. Farsight's armies docked at the orbital sky stations of the planet and threw themselves into the war below, and the war did not go well. The orc heavy weapons could punch through battlesuit plating in a way that the cruder weapons of older orc campaigns had never quite managed. Captured hammerheads and sky rays, repainted in glyphs and recrewed by greenskins, lurched out of the craters, firing Tau plasma at their former owners. Whirring copter craft hammered the Tau from above. At every impact site, the same pattern repeated itself. Initial Tau advance, fierce orc resistance, slow grinding loss of ground. And across the planet, the casualty reports climbed to figures Farsight had not seen since the worst hours of Arkanasha. It was salvation from the aircast, in the end, that broke the worst of the orc ferocity. Whole shoals of barracudas and tiger sharks descended from low orbit, and ship squadrons mowed down the skulking orc mobs in the rubble, and a manta destroyer that slaughtered those nearest the wrecked dagger ship with a storm of heavy railgun fire, and the sunshark bombers washed the ruins clean with chains of plasma. The orcs, for the first time in the campaign, were on the back foot, and it was at this moment, with his foes apparently broken and his momentum apparently restored, that Farsight made the mistake that would weigh upon him for the rest of his very long life. He led a cadre of his own warriors over the lip of the dagger ship's impact crater. He pursued the retreating orcs down into the shattered bowl below. He did so because the moment seemed to require it, because a commander leads from the front, because a great orc warlord might be in the crater and might be killable, because every instinct his Violan blood had ever given him was telling him that the killing blow was at hand and that the time to strike it was now. The crater was not the finishing of the orc host. The crater was the trap. Thousands of orcs who had been waiting in the rocks below poured up from concealment as Farsight's cadre descended, and the jaws of Grog Iron Teeth's true ambush closed around the Tau warriors with cruelty. The Tau could not bring fire to bear in every direction at once. They could not break out the way they had come in. They could not, by any reading of the tactical situation, do anything at all except die in the bottom of that crater under the weight of the orc charge, which was when Grog himself appeared at the lip of the bowl in his ostentatious armor and threw himself joyfully down into the slaughter. Farsight gave the order. He gave it because there was no other order he could give. He told his battlesuit teams to engage their jetpacks and boost out of the melee, to leave the ground, to leave the fight, to leave the warriors who could not boost away with them. They did so. They obeyed him, as they had always obeyed him. They fired into the orcs below them as they rose into the air, and they killed a great many in those parting shots. And the parting shots have been remembered in some of the more sentimental histories as a kind of last stroke of defiance against the trap. They were not. They were a parting gesture. The warriors he was firing over were already dying as he fired, and they were dying because he had led them where they should not have been led. He came up out of the crater in his battlesuit, and the survivors of his cadre came up with him, and the Ores por Cauyon recovered them safely back to the sky stations in the orbit above. The campaign on Atari Vo continued for many further weeks, and the planet was, in the end, freed of the Orc incursion through the costly work of the local commanders. Farsight remained on Atari Vo through the rest of that work, but he did not lead it. He acted only as an advisor. He risked himself on patrol after patrol, in engagement after engagement, with what one of his lieutenants would later describe, in private, as a recklessness that did not look like courage, so much as it looked like a man asking the orcs to settle a debt with him personally. They did not settle it. He came through every engagement alive. He came through them all, and the matter of the crater stayed where it was. What happened in the crater on Atari Vo was the first true defeat of his life. He had lost battles before. He had lost warriors before, a great many of them, in the long campaigns of the Arakin and the deserts of Arkanasha and the indigo grasses of Dalieth. But losing warriors is not, for a commander of his caliber, the same thing as being defeated. Warriors are lost in every campaign, and the loss of them, terrible as it is part of the balances of war that any honest commander accepts when he takes up the work. What had happened in the crater was different. He had not merely lost warriors there. He had been outwitted. He had been led by his own cleverness and his own pride into a position that another mind, an orcish mind, had foreseen and prepared for. He had been read. The Farsight who had spent 30 years reading the minds of his enemies had been, on a single afternoon, in a dust-choked bowl, on a half-ruined world, read by an enemy in his turn. The warriors he had ordered to boost away from had been his to lose, and their loss was no greater in numerical terms than losses he had absorbed in earlier campaigns, without lasting injury to his command. But these warriors had been left behind because of his mistake, and they had died because of his miscalculation, and there were a great many of them, and the order to leave them had come from his own throat. The records, in their tidy way, do not speak of what it costs a commander to give such an order. They simply note that the order was given, and the boost-out was successfully performed, and the surviving battlesuits were recovered to the orbital station for redeployment. They do not note that the man inside the lead battlesuit, in the long minutes of the boost upward through the air thick with orc fire, was hearing in his comms the voices of the warriors he was leaving below. The brief professional reports of warriors who knew they were not going to be evacuated and who were continuing to do their duty in the moments left to them, and that those voices stayed with him afterwards and were still with him many years later. There are stains of that kind that no later victory will wash off. He won other victories afterwards, a great many of them, and some of those victories were brilliant, and some of them were necessary, and some of them were greater in scale than anything he had achieved before. None of them touched Atari Vo. The crater was a thing that remained, and remained in him specifically, and the warrior who left Atari Vo for the next phase of his long story carried it with him out of that system, as he had carried the broken sword out of Arkanasha, and the two weights together were, by then, beginning to bend him in a direction that he himself was not yet ready to look at. When the surviving ships of the Farsight expedition emerged at last from the long crossing of the Damocles Gulf and saw what had become of the enclaves in their absence, the bridge of the flagship was for a long moment very still. The colonies they had left behind in good order, the bright young worlds that the reclamation had so recently planted upon the far side of the Gulf, were burning. The asteroid ships that Farsight had not been able to destroy in time had fallen upon them in his absence, and the same terrible tactic that had ruined Atari Vo had been employed against them in turn. The night skies above each of the enclave worlds, which had once been hung with the soft, glittering necklace of orbital bodies that the colonists had grown up looking at, were empty. The asteroids had come down. Violos and Lubgral and Tinekla were locked in desperate defensive battles for their survival. Even the ocean world of Salash Hay had iron-hulled orc battleships prowling its waters, breaking seas that had never before known the smell of orc engine oil upon their salt air. Farsight received the reports. He met with his commanders in the new high command of the Firecast, a great disc-shaped city that hovered above the ocean of Violos, at a height the local orc forces could not reach. He listened to his lieutenants explain, in careful and apologetic detail, how the war had reached the point it had reached. He asked how they could have permitted such a thing to come to pass. They told him. He listened. And when at last the briefing was complete and the strategies for the coming evacuation had been laid out for his consideration, he rose from his place at the council table and gave a short instruction to his lieutenants, which was that they were to continue the war in his absence and to fight it as best they could, and to expect no further word from him until he returned. Then he walked out of the council chamber, and he climbed into the cradle of his crisis battlesuit, and he engaged the jets and lifted off the great hovering deck of the Disk City, and he flew away across the ocean towards the horizon. The lieutenant stood for a long while watching him go. The shape of his battlesuit grew smaller and smaller against the bright sky, until it was only a dark point, and then not even that. And then he was gone. What he did in those long weeks has come down to us in the records of the enclaves, with the slightly elevated cadence that the keepers of those records reserved for things they were not entirely sure had happened in the literal way the witnesses had described. He went in search of communion with the elements of the world he had adopted as his home, and he sought that communion in 4 separate places, and the 4 meditations together would be remembered afterwards as the turning of him, the moment when the Farsight, who had returned, defeated from Atari Vo, became the Farsight who would lead the enclaves out of their darkest hour. He went first to the water. He flew low across the saline ocean of Violos, the shadow of his battlesuit racing him across the pale waves, and at last he tipped the suit forward and plunged it into the sea. He sank a long way, down past the upper sunlit layers, down through the dim middle waters, where the great glowfish of Violos moved in their slow schools, down at last to the dark of the ocean bed, where the only light was the soft phosphorescence of the bubbles bleeding up from oceanic fissures, and the occasional pale gleam of the predators called night sharks. He set the battlesuit into the cross-legged hero's posture upon the seabed, and he closed his eyes, and he sat there in the cold and the dark for 7 cycles of the planet's day. What he learned from the water in those cycles he never afterwards described in any detail, but those who knew him best said that he came up out of the ocean with a stillness in him that had not been in him when he went down. He went next to the air. His battlesuit rose from the sea in a great cloud of spray and arrowed across the sky towards the volcanic ranges at the heart of the Violos landmass, and he climbed and climbed, until he came at last to the peak of the dormant volcano Ores. There he hung in the high, thin air above the summit, the suit's jets working steadily against the great winds that rolled across the upper altitudes, and he opened the cradle of the suit and let the wind come in. He listened to it. He listened until he had begun to understand the patterns it was making. The long, slow gyres of the upper atmosphere, the small, quick eddies that gathered in the lee of the peaks, the way one current drew another along behind it as a hunter draws a hound. His trance ended when he had come to know the air. He went next to the earth. He plunged into a deep canyon at the heart of the volcanic range, and from there into the sulphurous tunnels that honeycombed the underside of the planet's crust. And he laid himself flat upon his back in one of those tunnels with the trickles of lava moving slowly past him in the dark, and the poisonous fumes drifting around the suit's life support intakes. And there he stayed for some considerable time. The earth, by the lights of his meditation, was not a quick thing. It was not an angry thing in the way that fire was angry. It burned slowly, when it burned at all, with a terrible heat that no impatience could match. He learned, by his own later accounting, to think the way the planet's core thought, which is to say, to think in great slow movements that took centuries to complete. It is not a kind of thinking that is much use upon a battlefield, but it is perhaps a kind of thinking that is useful for a commander to have visited at least once. He went last to the fire, and the fire was the meditation that changed him most visibly. The wars upon Violos had set the dry forests of the planet ablaze in a great many places, and the wildfires had grown by then into something that was less a series of separate fires than a single vast burning that rolled across the landscape with a will of its own. He flew his battlesuit into the heart of one such burning. He stayed inside it. The smell of his own flesh beginning to roast filled the cradle of the suit, and he did not cry out, and he did not engage the jets to lift him out, and he did not give any sign of distress at all. He sat in the fire. And when at last he came out of it, hours later, the color of his skin had been changed forever. The grey-pale tone of the Violan native had been burned away from him, and what had taken its place was a deep, almost black hue that he would carry for the rest of his very long life, and which the warriors of the enclaves would in time come to regard as one of the marks by which their commander could be known. His crisis battle suit, when he flew at last out of the fire, was said by those who saw it to look like an ember moving across the night sky. He returned to the war, and the war, in the weeks that followed his return, began to turn in ways that none of his lieutenants could have arranged on their own. Above the crystal plains of Tinekla, where the elegant Tau fighter craft had been dueling for weeks with the snub-nosed Orc aircraft and slowly losing the engagement through sheer attrition, Farsight appeared in the sky without warning and gave the strangest order any of the aircast pilots had ever received. He told them, every one of them, to override their consoles and release their propellant gases into the air. He told them when they had done so to shape the release of those gases in odd patterns according to his coordinates. And then, when the air above the plains was thick with the volatile emissions of every Tau fighter in the engagement, he ignited the entire suspended cloud with a single shot from the plasma rifle of his battlesuit. A great gale of flame rolled across the sky of Tinekla. The Tau craft, riding the thermals of the firestorm and burning what little of their own fuel remained to clear the leading edge of the blaze, were lifted to safety upon the rising heat. The Orc aircraft, which had no such anticipation and no such fuel discipline, were caught in the sheet of flame and consumed where they flew. The surface below was simultaneously scoured clean of the greenskin spores that had been corrupting the crystal plains. Tinekla was, in the space of a single afternoon, freed. Upon the watery world of Salash-Hay, where the iron-hulled Orc battleships had been prowling the seas with a brutal impunity for months. Farsight dove once again to the bottom of the ocean, this time carrying with him a series of disc-shaped devices that Ovesa, his old friend in the Earthcast, had designed to his specifications. The devices were called seismic fibrillators, and what they did was provoke the natural oceanic vents of the planet into a sympathetic resonance that turned the ordinary motion of the seabed into something far less ordinary. The thumps of the fibrillators echoed up through the dark water, and the vents answered them, and within hours the seas above had risen into tsunamis of such extreme height that the Orc battleships, for all their iron hulls, were turned over and capsized one after another, like leaves on a stream. Upon Lubgrol, the favored planet of the Earthcast, where the great rock spires of the landscape had become natural fortresses around which the surviving population had clustered, and which the Orcs had besieged in hordes too vast to count, he gave the Earthcast a different order. He had the entire fleet of Tinekla called in to extreme low orbit, and he had the great oval living nodes of Lubgrau mag-lifted from their positions upon the planet's surface and held above it, suspended in the careful gravitic embrace of the orbital ships. And then, with the population safely lifted clear, he dropped a clutch of fibrillators into the great crevasse called Bogle, the abyss at the heart of the planet. The world shuddered, the shuddering grew, and every one of the great rock spires of Lubgrau, towers of stone that had stood for 10,000 years, collapsed in upon themselves and buried the besieging Orc hordes beneath 40 meters of solid rock. The living nodes were lowered back down upon the new crust. By the end of the week, the population had been restored. By the end of the month, the Earthcast was already at work upon the rebuilding. Throughout all of this, Farsight had reserved one matter for himself. He hunted Grog Iron Teeth across the ruins of the campaigns the Warchief had set in motion. He found Grog at last in the eye of one of the artificial firestorms he had loosed upon Viorlos to sterilize the last of the Orc infestations there, and the Warchief was, by all accounts, attacking his own followers in some attempt to reimpose his fading authority upon them. Farsight emerged from the fire alone. He carried with him a small object, and the object, when his lieutenants saw it later, proved to be a sparkling globe filled with fine grey ash, upon the surface of which had been engraved the names of each of the Enclave worlds that Grog had tried to ruin. Of all the worlds that Commander Farsight visited in the long course of his career, the one that troubles his biographers most is Arthas Moloch, and it troubles them not because of the scale of the violence that unfolded there, which was modest by the standards of his other campaigns, but because of what the violence revealed. There are some places in the galaxy where the curtain that ordinarily hangs between the world we can see and the world we cannot is worn very thin indeed, and Arthas Moloch was such a place, and what Farsight saw through the worn place in the curtain, there was a thing that no later experience of his life ever entirely allowed him to put down again. He had pursued the second cluster of Grog Iron Teeth's asteroid fleet to that world some considerable time before, in the same campaign that had taken him to Atari Vo, and had been forced to leave the matter of Arthas Moloch unfinished while he addressed the more immediate emergency at the Enclaves. Now, with Viorlos reborn and the Orcs of the home worlds destroyed, he returned to finish what he had begun. The Aircast's preliminary surveys reported only modest Orc activity in the planet's built-up zones, and little to no other life of any kind beyond it. Arthas Moloch was a dead world, by every reasonable measure. Its pre-human civilization had been ground to dust some 30 millennia before by hands the Tau could not name, and what remained of that civilization was a scattering of stone monuments and ruined shrines, among which only the Orcs now moved. It was, on the face of it, a perfectly ordinary purge, the kind of clean work that Farsight had performed 100 times before across 100 similar worlds. He came down with his cadres in the cool morning of the world, and he went to work. The orcs were divided and largely leaderless, as orcs separated from their warchief tend to be, and the hunter cadres broke them. It was at the 8-pillared temple that the Aircast's mapping survey had named the Great Star Dais, a low, broad amphitheater of dark stone, 8 tall pillars at its perimeter, a great star carved into the flagstones at its center, that the day began to go strange. Each orc that fell upon the dais bled, and there was nothing in itself unusual about that. What was unusual was what the blood did. It did not simply pool upon the stone. It seemed to be drawn into the carving of the star, gathering along the lines of it. And as the carved star began to fill with the dark wet of the orc, dead a faint disk of multicolored light began to gather above it, hanging in the air a few meters above the flagstones. Farsight, who was overseeing this part of the purge personally, stood watching the disk for a long while in the cradle of his battlesuit. He was fascinated rather than alarmed at first. He had killed dozens of the greenskins on the dais himself, and he watched the way the light grew brighter with each killing, and he turned the matter over in his quick mind, and did not yet quite know what he was looking at. What he was looking at was a portal. It was being summoned by the spilling of blood upon a place that had been carved many thousands of years before for precisely such a summoning, by entities of a kind for which the Tau had at that time no name at all. The blood was a key, the carving was the lock, and what came through the lock, when at last the disk of light steadied and brightened into something almost solid, was a host of beings that no Firecast warrior had ever before seen. There were tall crimson-skinned figures with horns, and they came onto the dais, bearing swords so deeply black that the swords seemed to be holes cut into the air itself. They moved with a swift, terrible grace, and they fell upon the surviving orcs without preamble and without expression. And the orcs, who had been the most violent thing on Arthas Moloch a moment before, found themselves suddenly facing creatures whose appetite for violence was of an order entirely beyond their own. Demons of the blood god, drawn by the killing. Farsight, in the cradle of his battlesuit upon that dais, did not have such a word. He had only what his eyes were showing him, and what his eyes were showing him was that the universe contained categories of creatures that he had not been told existed. After the crimson swordsman came others. Bright pink things tumbled out of the disk with comically long limbs and high, laughing voices. And they raised their hands to the sky and sent forth flames in every color, for which the Tau had a name, and several for which they did not. The flames did not behave as flames behave. A passing ship, struck by a stream of one of them, became in an instant a delicate sculpture of kaleidoscopic glass, and shattered to the ground in 1,000 singing pieces. Tau warriors caught by other streams of the strange fire became, before the eyes of their comrades, statues of pale water that held their fighting postures for a moment, and then collapsed into puddles on the flagstones. Others became stone, others became, most dreadfully, screaming statues of bone, perfectly preserved in the attitude of their last moment, which continued for some time afterwards to scream. Demons of the Changer of Ways, drawn by the rupture. Farsight did not have words for these either. He had only the fact that some of his warriors, a moment before, had been warriors, and now were not. He gave the order for retreat, and his cadres responded with the discipline they had spent their lives building, and the survivors began to lift away from the dais towards the safety of the orbital ships above. He himself, alone of all the warriors present, paused at the edge of the dais and looked back. When he looked into the disk of light, he saw, by his own much later account, a vast wound in the substance of the universe, a rip in the fabric of reality of a scale that no part of his training had prepared him to comprehend. He saw, very far away across that wound, what seemed to him to be the whole of the galaxy turning slowly within it, and he saw a place at the heart of the wound where a great cyclonic storm of unmaking had been turning for longer than any civilization the Tau knew of had existed. He saw 1,000,000,000,000 deaths within the wound, each one calling his name. He saw, perhaps worst of all, that the wound had noticed him. A small thread of blood began to run between his eyes, the place that the Tau reverence as the seat of perception, the place that opens and closes when an ethereal speaks. The blood ran down across his cheek inside the cradle of the battlesuit, and the world began to dim, and the suit's automated systems engaged just before he lost consciousness altogether, dragging him up into the air upon their own initiative, and carrying him in a long, shallow descent through the ruins of the city, beyond the dais, until the suit at last came to rest, half buried, in the cobwebbed dark of an ancient tomb. He did not wake for some considerable time. When he did wake, in the medbay of his flagship, his first instructions were that the evacuation of Arthas Moloch was to be cancelled. His warriors had caused the rupture, and his warriors would close it. The ethereals attached to his expedition agreed. The Firecast returned to the dais. The second engagement is described in the records with rather more clarity than the first, perhaps because by then they were dealing with something they could at least categorize as a battle. The orcs, drawn by the noise of the previous engagement and by the natural orcish enthusiasm for a fight wherever a fight was being had converged upon the dais in great numbers and were busily hurling themselves into the demonic host that was still pouring out of the disk. Farsight tasked one detachment of his force with destroying the orcs at extreme range, and another with monitoring the demons without engaging, and brought his battlesuit cadre forward himself. It was during the worst of the second battle, when one of the great winged demons that had come through with the swordsman was attacking him in close combat, that Farsight was knocked backwards by the creature's clawed feet into the rubble of an ancient toppled statue. The statue had once held a curved sword in its outstretched stone hand, and the sword had fallen free of the rubble when the statue broke, and Farsight, rolling sideways out of the path of the demon's brass axe, snatched the sword up and brought it round in a wide, swift arc. The sword cut. The demon recoiled. The fight moved on. He kept the sword. He did not at the time quite know why he had kept it, except that it had been to hand when he needed something and had served him well, and that there was something in the weight of it as he carried it back to his battlesuit's cradle that suggested it was not an ordinary blade. It would in time be called the Dawn Blade, and it would become the thing that sustained him beyond the natural span of his life, and it would prove to be a great deal more than he had bargained for. But on the afternoon when he picked it up out of the rubble of the toppled statue on Arthas Moloch, it was only a curious old sword that had happened to be there when he reached for it, and he carried it back to the lines without giving the matter much further thought. The closing of the rupture was managed at last by a pair of strange medallions found in the hands of two further statues among the ruins beyond the dais. The medallions were marked with a six-sided sigil, whose lines, when Farsight looked at them, seemed to settle the pain that the rift had set ringing in his head. He did not understand the sigils, but he understood that the medallions were the answer. He gathered them. He stormed the dais with his battlesuit, with his fire warriors holding the perimeter against the orcs, and at the moment when three of the great winged demons came down upon him from above, he flicked the sword in his hand in a small, lazy gesture and sent the medallions sailing up into the disk of light at the center of the dais. The rift closed. The demons disappeared, and the skies cleared. When the dust at last settled, and the survivors of his expedition began the work of accounting for who was still among them, the news that came up to him was not the news of his victory. It was the news that all 3 of the ethereals who had accompanied his expedition were dead. All 3. Onlos had been cut in 2 by the great brass axe of one of the winged things in a fountain near the dais, and the halves of him had bled their last into the water. Ondian had been gored to death by another of the creatures in the wilderness beyond. The 3rd ethereal had been found, headless, in a circle of his unconscious bodyguards. There was no ethereal left to lead the expedition. There was no ethereal left to consult on what had happened. The Enclave's entire spiritual leadership for this campaign had been removed in a single afternoon, with such surgical neatness that Farsight, who had spent his life learning to recognize patterns, could not avoid the understanding that this had not been an accident at all. It is at this point in the long story of Farsight's life that he experienced a thought cascade, of the kind that visits a careful mind when one of the foundational stones of that mind has been removed and the rest of the structure has begun, slowly, to settle in the absence of the stone. The ethereals had not been surprised by the demons. He had watched the recordings of those final moments from the bodyguard's helmet feeds, and the ethereals' faces, in the seconds before they died, had not held the expressions of beings encountering a thing for the first time. They had held the expressions of beings who had recognized what they were looking at. They had known what such creatures were, and where such creatures came from, and what kind of place lay beyond the rifts that summoned them. And they had not, in all the decades during which they had advised him and his fellow commanders, ever once mentioned any of it. If they had known about the demons and said nothing, then what else had they known about? He thought. Sitting in his command chamber on the long voyage back to the enclaves of the strange storms that had spat the Imperial fleet through the fabric of space during the Damocles Crusade. He thought of the strange psychers whose presence on the battlefield had so badly confounded the swords of Puretide. He thought of the way the orc shamans had occasionally seemed to make weather happen merely by demanding it. He thought of the rust devils he himself had glimpsed once or twice in the deserts of Arkanasha, the small whirling presences that had seemed almost to want something. He thought of all of these things that he had been told throughout his long career were odd unexplained features of an essentially material universe. He thought of how often the ethereals, when these matters had been raised in council, had gently steered the conversation elsewhere. He thought, too, of the obedience. He had served the ethereal caste all his life, and he had served it gladly, and the obedience he had given had always felt like the natural obedience of a warrior to his rightful masters. But sitting now in his ship, with the news of 3 dead ethereals weighing upon his conscience and the carved sword from the toppled statue resting upon the table in front of him, he began to remember small moments from his career that he had never quite questioned at the time. Warriors who had gone unnaturally calm in the presence of an ethereal. Decisions accepted with a swiftness that could not entirely be accounted for by their merits. The peculiar way that the founding myth of his people, the story of how the ethereals had appeared from the stars to broker peace between the warring castes in the course of a single night, sounded less like an internal resolution among the Tau than like an external force having been applied to them from somewhere outside. He turned each of these moments over in his mind, and the more carefully he turned them, the worse they began to look. It is a kind of grief that visits a faithful man when he begins to understand that the loyalty he has spent his life giving has perhaps been given to something other than what he believed it was being given to. It does not arrive quickly. It does not arrive all at once. It comes in pieces, over the course of days and weeks and sometimes years, and each piece settles into the larger structure with a soft, awful click. By the time the last piece was in place, Farsight was not the warrior who had set out for Arthur's Moloch. He had become a man whose mind contained things that could not, under any circumstances, be allowed back into the heartlands of the Empire. For if he were to bring such thoughts before the ethereal council, if he were to sit before Anvar himself, in the great chambers of the homeworlds, and say what he was thinking, what would happen? Either Anvar would explain, and his explanation would either confirm what Farsight feared, or would soothe it falsely. Or Anvar would not explain, and would have Farsight removed, and the matter would be ended in the way that such matters were ended. Or worst of all, Farsight would speak the truths he was now carrying, and they would spread, and the populace of the Empire would hear them, and the structure of Tau civilization, which had been built upon the assumption that the ethereals knew best, would begin to crack along lines from which it might never recover. The Mon Tau, the time of horror that had come before the ethereals first appeared, might come again. He understood, sitting alone in his command chamber with the carved sword in front of him, that the most dangerous threat to the Tau Empire he had served all his life was no longer the Imperium of mankind, and was no longer the greenskin hordes upon its fringes, and was no longer the laughing demons of the dais. It was him. He returned to Violos. He gave orders for the continuance of the Enclave's defenses, and then, with the same unannounced manner with which he had once flown out across the ocean towards the horizon, he left his command. He stripped off the battle suit that had carried him through so many wars, and gave it into the keeping of others. He put aside the trappings of his rank, and he walked away into the searing wilderness of the Violos plains, where the sun was hot, and the dust was deep, and there were no comms relays, and no honor guards, and no ethereals to read his face, and there he made for himself the long exile that he had decided, in his way, was the only way he could be allowed to keep what he had now come to know. He took the carved sword with him. He still did not, at that point in his life, know quite what it was, but he took it all the same. The years that followed Farsight's exile were, for the wider Tau Empire, years of something they were not accustomed to feeling, which was grief. The probes that had been sent across the Damocles Gulf to maintain communication with the reclamation fleet stopped, one by one, returning anything at all. The communication beacons that had been so carefully positioned at the edge of Tau-held space sent their signals out into the dark and received, after the appropriate interval, only silence in return. The Watercast, who had been the primary architects of the great public love affair between the Empire and its hero, were the first to begin preparing the citizenry for the worst. They did so gently, in the way they did most things, and over the course of several years they let the bright certainty of his return be replaced, conversation by conversation, and broadcast by broadcast, with the slowly settling acceptance that he was not coming home. When at last the formal announcement was made, the grief that followed was not the grief of an empire that had lost a useful soldier. It was the grief of an empire that had lost a kind of weather. He had been the bright thing the Watercast had pointed to in difficult years, the figure whose victories had been rehearsed at the dinner tables of 3 generations of Tau children, and his loss left a shape in the public life of the Sept worlds that no other warrior was quite the right size to fill. Old veterans of campaigns he had touched only briefly wept openly when the announcement was read aloud in the great battle domes. Children too young to remember any of his actual battles wept because their parents were weeping. Anvar himself, in a speech of considerable dignity and considerable craft, paid the long formal tribute that the moment required. The Empire mourned, and it mourned sincerely, and for a long while the matter was settled. It was settled, that is, until the probe came back. It was nothing very dramatic. The probe, a small routine outrider of the kind that the long-range patrols dispatched as a matter of standing procedure, and which were assumed to disappear into the Gulf and never return. This one, by some small grace of the Gulf's strange currents, did return. It came back in good order, and its sensors had recorded, on its long automatic loop through the far side of the anomaly, a series of images that the analysts at the receiving station did not at first quite believe. The Farsight enclaves were not empty. They were not the silent ruin of a heroic last stand, as the official histories had settled into assuming. They were thriving. Their cities had been rebuilt upon the worlds the orcs had once burned. Their fleets moved in good order between their planets. The sept colors of their banners had altered, in subtle but unmistakable ways, from the colors that the home worlds remembered, and the small ceremonial markings of their public spaces had grown in directions of their own. And amidst the small details that the probe's cameras had captured, in 1 or 2 passes over the central cities, there appeared to be a figure in an early pattern crisis battle suit, dark-skinned even by the standards of those who served beside him, who walked through the public places of the enclaves in a way that suggested he was not merely tolerated there, but heeded. Farsight was alive. The enclaves were alive. And they had, with what the probe's images suggested was entirely deliberate determination, made themselves into something other than a province of the wider Tau Empire. The fury that took hold of Aunva when this news was brought before him was not the fury of an angry man. It was something much colder than that. He had spent considerable years arranging the public mourning of a hero he had himself created, and he had done that work in good faith because he had believed that the hero in question was beyond the reach of any further trouble. To learn that the hero was not only alive, but had chosen to remain alive somewhere beyond the reach of the Council's correction. This was a thing that Aunva did not permit himself to react to in any visible way at all. He sat with it, he thought about it, and when at last he gave his orders, the orders were of a kind that the Empire had not previously known its supreme ethereal to be capable of. Farsight, by formal decree of the Ethereal Council, was excommunicated from the greater good. The phrasing of the decree was carefully crafted to leave no room for sentimental reinterpretation. He was a renegade. He was a traitor. He had abandoned the cause to which he had pledged his life, and he had taken with him a great many warriors who should have known better, and the only honorable response to his existence was for the Empire to forget, with as much thoroughness as possible, that he had ever been a part of it at all. The statues came down. They came down across every sept world that had once raised them, and the holographic recordings of his victories were removed from the public archives, and the children's books that had been used to teach his deeds were withdrawn and pulped. The hunters' salutes that had once been offered to his image in passing were forgotten. Old veterans who spoke too fondly of him in the wrong company were taken away, in the gentle euphemistic phrase the watercast preferred, for sessions of questioning, and many of those veterans were not afterwards seen by their families. It was not a brutal purge, in the way that the Imperium would have understood brutality. It was something subtler than that, and in some ways more thorough, for it set out to remove not the man, but the memory of him. Only on Viola, where the love for him ran deeper than the love for the Council, were people who were prepared to confront directly. And here, there was a single statue allowed to remain. It stood outside the great battle dome of Montier, where he had first been inducted into the academies of the Firecast. To pull it down might have caused a backlash that even Aunva did not quite wish to provoke, and so the statue was permitted to stay. But it was permitted to stay under a new and rather different reading. It was no longer a monument, It was, by official designation, a grave reminder. It stood now to instruct future generations that even the finest warrior the Empire had ever produced could be turned from the light if he was unwise enough to step beyond the loving guidance of the ethereal caste. The statue was the same statue it had always been. The story attached to it was now a different story altogether. Across the long span of the Damocles Gulf, the enclaves themselves knew very little of any of this, and would not for some considerable time. They had their own work to be getting on with. The world's Farsight had restored to them, were flourishing under the careful stewardship of a generation of commanders who had grown into their authority during his absence, and the sept identities of those worlds were settling into shapes that were not quite the same shapes as the home worlds had known. There were small differences in the way the four castes spoke to one another. There were small differences in the way the children were taught the founding stories. There was, above all, the simple hard fact that no ethereal walked among them, for the ethereals attached to the original expedition had all died at Arthas Moloch, and no others had come to replace them, and the long absence of that guidance had begun to grow into a new kind of presence of its own. Farsight himself, in those years, was less and less seen. He had returned briefly from his exile to do the work the enclaves had needed him to do, and he had then, in the gentle way of him, slipped sideways out of the daily life of his colonies and into an existence on the periphery. He was there. The warriors of the enclaves all knew in some general way that he was there, but he was not, for those long middle decades, a daily figure in the affairs of state, and the generations of his people who grew up during his withdrawal grew up with him as a kind of distant beloved presence, rather than as a leader they actually saw. He was, in their minds, increasingly more legend than man, an old hero in the wilderness whose return, when they thought about it at all, would presumably come if it was ever needed, and who in the meantime did not need to be troubled. It came, as such things tend to come, without much in the way of warning. The hermit who had made his home in the high desert places of Violos had been watching the sky with attentiveness for some weeks before he understood what he was seeing, and even then he did not at first quite want to believe it. The clouds had begun to take on a sickly purple-grey tinge at their edges, in the way that clouds sometimes do when something high above them has begun to interfere with the ordinary light of the sun. The cacti and creepers that had been his companions through the long years of his exile, and which had given him the small, precious quantities of water that had kept him alive, had begun to swell and bloat and grow into shapes that were not their proper shapes. Shapes that suggested an outside hand was reaching down into the very chemistry of the soil and gently rearranging the rules of what was permitted to grow there. He sat in the mouth of his cave one evening with a creeper in his hand, whose tendrils had developed small bony hooks where no hooks had been the week before, and he turned the creeper over in his fingers, and he thought for a long while about what kind of hand reaches down out of the sky and makes such alterations to a world. He could think of only one kind. He had read about them in the records of the war the Empire had fought against Hive Fleet Gorgons some years before, in those long evenings of his hermitage, when the records were the only company he kept, and he knew what the swelling of the cacti meant, and he knew what the purple sky meant, and he knew, sitting there, with the small wrong creeper in his hand, that the time of his exile was over. He took a long breath. He set the creeper down carefully upon the stone, in case it was still in some way a living thing, and he rose, in the slow way of a man whose joints have not been asked to move quickly in some considerable while, and he walked down out of the high desert towards the cities of his people. He came at last to the doors of the great Violos Museum, where the crisis battlesuit he had once worn through so many wars was kept upon a tall plinth in a hall of honor. and he asked with the gentle politeness that had always been his, even in his most difficult moments, that the battlesuit be returned to him. The young curator at the door, who had been born some considerable time after Farsight's withdrawal from public life, and who had only the faintest second-hand memory of what he was supposed to look like, did not at first know what to make of the dark-skinned old warrior at her threshold. There were any number of perfectly ordinary madmen in those weeks, who turned up at the doors of public institutions, claiming to be the long-lost commander of the enclaves, and the curator had been instructed to handle each of them with as much patience as she could manage, and to send each of them on their way. She began gently to do so. The old warrior listened to her courteous explanation, and he nodded, and he asked with no apparent annoyance at all, whether she might be willing to perform the genetic tests that the matter formally required. She considered him for a moment longer. There was something in his bearing that she could not quite explain to herself. She agreed. The tests were, of course, conclusive. Word ran through the enclaves that day, faster than any official broadcast, and more reliable than any formal channel, and by the time Farsight had been suited again into the cradle that had been waiting so many years for him, his lieutenants were already gathering in the high command, and the Firecast was already redoubling its efforts in the sky and on the ground, lifted by the simple and somewhat childish joy of knowing that the old hero had come back to them when they needed him most. The war did not, however, go well at first. Farsight, returning to command after his long withdrawal, did what Farsight had always done. He turned his quick mind upon the foe, and he studied its patterns, and he devised the killing strokes of the Montka that had served him so well across the long course of his career. He hunted the leader beasts at the heart of each tyrannid swarm, the great synapse creatures whose presence held the lesser broods in their fighting cohesion, and he killed them one by one with the pinpoint application of force that had been his signature for the better part of 2 centuries. It should have worked. It had worked in some form against every other foe he had ever faced, but the Tyranids were a different kind of foe altogether, and the leader beasts were not single, irreplaceable commanders, but merely the current expression of a deeper coordinating intelligence somewhere far above, and every leader Farsight killed was replaced within hours by another, dropped from the swelling sky in a fat-bodied mycetic spore, and stitched by the hive mind into the same role its predecessor had held. The Montka was striking, and the strokes were finding their targets, and the targets simply did not stay struck. He sat in the council chambers of his command afterwards, in a private silence that his lieutenants knew not to interrupt, and he turned the matter over in his mind. He had spent 200 years winning wars by the doctrine of the killing blow. He had pursued that doctrine across deserts and oceans and the burning skies of 3 home worlds. He had loved it the way a craftsman loves the tool he has shaped his hands to, and he had refined it in himself until it was the way he saw battle. And now, on the last and perhaps the most terrible foe he would ever face, the doctrine was failing him. It was Ovesa, his oldest friend among the Earthcast, clinging now to a great and honorable age by means of a cocktail of regenerative drugs of his own invention, and not entirely the man he had once been, but still in possession of the careful mind that Farsight had relied upon for half his life, who at last raised the matter that no one else had been quite willing to raise. "If the killing blow will not work, my friend," the old scientist said, in the gentle voice that he had perfected in the days when Farsight had first known him, "perhaps the moment has come to try the more patient hunter instead." Farsight grimaced. The chroniclers of the enclaves note the grimace specifically, because it was something that even his closest aides rarely saw upon his face. To use the Kauyon was to acknowledge that the Montka had failed him. To use the Kauyon was, in some small private way, to use the doctrine of his old comrade Chasera, and to do so on a battlefield where she had not done him the courtesy of being present. To use the Kauyon was, perhaps worst of all, to admit that his master upon Mount Kanji had been right. All those long years before, when he had hoped that one of his pupils might learn to fight in the manner of the others, Farsight had not learned. He had refused, with all the warmth of his Violan heart, to learn. He grimaced, and then, after a long moment, he nodded. What followed was the defense of the small earth-cast research facility called Fiorotl, in a deep valley in the dust country of Violos, and it has been remembered ever since in the records of the enclaves with the fondness that the chroniclers reserve for the engagements they have liked the best. He had emptied the rest of his world. He had ordered the entire civilian population of Violos to evacuate, and the evacuation had been carried out under the protection of his warriors, and by the 8th day of the operation, there were only 12 Tau left upon the entire planet. Farsight himself, his 7 most trusted commanders, the venerable Oveza, and 3 of the most capable scientists that Lubgraul had been able to provide. The Tyranids, drawn by the rich biomass of an inhabited world, came down upon them in their millions, and the 8 battlesuits arranged themselves around the small, modest building of the research facility, and held the line, and bought the scientists the hours that the scientists needed. The history books describe each of the 7 commanders with care. Oblatai, that is to say the engram suit Oblatai 9-0, into which the recorded mind of Farsight's old XV-88 mentor had been carefully transferred, took up his position upon the roof of the facility, and bullseyed leader beasts at extreme range. The 7th of those who had borne the title of Commander Brightsword cut through the great battering ram beasts at the gates with his fusion blades, the alien ichor evaporating in choking clouds around him as he felled one creature, boosted away, and slashed through another. Old Shavastos, who had survived the lobotomy decreed for him so many decades earlier only because Farsight had once told a careful lie to an ethereal at a doorway, fought side by side with the young Commander Torchstar, the 2 of them sweeping the lesser weapon beasts from the rocks with great rolling sheets of flame. Wise Commander Arakon, whose calm voice the cadres of the enclaves had been learning to trust for many years by then, orchestrated the whole defense as a conductor orchestrates an orchestra, distributing the firing solutions and adjusting the rhythms of the engagement as each new ingress opened in the perimeter. And there was Bravestorm, who has perhaps the most tender entry, the warrior whose body had been so badly broken in some earlier battle that he had been permanently interred within a life-supporting battlesuit, kept alive only by the careful machinery of the suit itself. When a towering monstrosity at the heart of the swarm killed Shas-O Varga by burning him to death inside his riptide with a blast of bioelectricity, Bravestorm did the thing that he could perhaps only have done because he was already, in the deeper sense, a man who had lived past his own death. He charged the great Tyranid Biotitan beneath its midsection. He powered his ancient onager gauntlet to its maximum setting, and he punched out the creature's thorax in a single great salute, in the name of his fallen comrade, and stood there afterwards in the wreckage of the thing breathing the heavy mechanical breath of his ruined lungs, while the battle continued around him. It was Oveza, at the very last, who delivered the death blow to a squat-bodied brood beast that had been birthing lesser Tyranids directly into the corridors of the facility. The old scientist did so by remotely engaging the interface of Varga's fallen riptide and bringing its weapon systems back online with his own gnarled fingers, firing the suit of his dead colleague one last time so that the colleague might claim in death the kill that had been denied him in life. The Manta destroyer, Ores Porcauion, descended in a great cloud of dust and the surviving warriors lifted into its hold, and the research facility behind them was buried under leaping Tyranid bodies as the door closed. Of the brave Earth-caste scientists, only Oveza came out alive. What the others had done in their workshop while the 8 battlesuits had been holding the line outside was the thing that ended the war. They had developed a suite of self-replicating necrotic agents. They had fashioned them carefully and tested them and prepared them for release. And then, knowing precisely what they were doing, they had imbibed the agents themselves, taking the poisons into their own bodies as the final act of their long careers. When the Tyranids stripped Violos at last of its biomass, when the great ribbed mouthparts of the hive ships descended upon the empty world and rendered every remaining living thing into the digestion pools of the swarm, they took the bodies of the scientists with them, and they took the poisons within those bodies as well. The agents activated upon the time delay the scientists had set them to. They spread through the digestion pools. They spread in vapor and in fluid through the great vessels of the hive fleet itself. And from his position in the high orbit above his ruined home, Farsight watched the bioships of the Tyranids begin, one by one, to rot. It happened quickly, once it began. A black stain spread across the flank of the leading bioship, then across the next, then across all of them, until the entire fleet was discoloring and writhing and falling in upon itself like fruit decomposing in a single afternoon. Within an hour, the Tyranid presence above Violos was gone, and the world below had been stripped to bare rock, and the long vengeance of the Earth caste had been completed. Farsight stood in the bridge of the Manta and watched it happen. He had spent 200 years in the company of warriors. He had given his life to the Fire caste and had been given much in return. And he had come to think of the greater good as a thing primarily expressed by warriors in the work of war. The ethereals had spoken of it more loudly, of course, and the water caste had explained it more eloquently, and the politicking of the homeworlds had used it as a kind of currency for as long as he could remember. But he himself, when he reached for the meaning of the phrase in his own heart, had reached for the warriors. The warriors fought, the warriors died, the warriors gave up their lives so that others might live. That to him was the greater good in its purest form. He saw, watching the Tyranid fleet rot in the high orbit above his ruined world, that he had been wrong about that. Or not wrong, perhaps, but partial. The Earth caste scientists who had drunk their own poisons and gone willingly down into the digestion pools of an alien horror had not been warriors. They had been careful old men who had spent their lives in laboratories, and who had developed a single elegant solution to a problem that no battlefield doctrine could have solved, and who had then offered up their own bodies as the vector by which the solution could be delivered. They had done so without ceremony. They had done so without fanfare. They had done so, in fact, without his even knowing they had done it until the moment when the bioships began to fail. And what they had done was the greater good, in a form so pure that the politicking of the homeworlds, the inflated speeches of the water caste, the grand pronouncements of the ethereal council, all of it seemed, set against this small, terrible sacrifice, to be a kind of noisy decoration around a thing that had been simple all along. The greater good was not the speeches. The greater good was the willingness of 3 old scientists, in a small workshop in a dust valley on a world they had loved, to drink the poisons they had made and walk knowingly into the mouths of the Tyranids so that the rest of their people might live. He understood, standing there in the bridge of the Manta with the smell of his ruined planet faintly reaching him through the recyclers, that he had been carrying a wound about the ethereals for a very long time, and that the wound had been souring his vision of his own civilization, and that the scientist's sacrifice had cleaned the wound a little, Not entirely. Not enough that he was ever again going to send the enclaves home to the embrace of Anvar, but enough that he understood, perhaps for the first time in many years, what it was that he was fighting for. The flame of his ambition, which had burned low for some time, kindled again that afternoon. He had seen what the greater good actually looked like, when one stripped away the politicking and the propaganda and the speeches, and he found that he loved it as much as he had ever loved anything, and he knew that the enclaves would need a leader if they were going to keep faith with what those scientists had done. He turned to his officers. He gave the orders for the rebuilding to begin, and the long last age of his life, the age in which he is still living, so far as anyone has been able to determine, began upon the bridge of that Manta, in the minutes after a hive fleet had finished rotting in the sky above a world that would be reborn. There remain, at the close of any honest biography of Commander Farsight, a number of questions to which the records do not return clean answers, and the gentlest thing a chronicler can do, after so long a journey through the certainties of his life, is to set those questions down honestly upon the page and admit that they have not been resolved. The first and largest of them is the simple question of his life itself. He has, at the time these words are being set down, been alive for something a little over 3 Terran centuries, which is considerably longer than the natural span of any Tau, save the unknowable ethereals. There are theories in the long records, and each theory has its supporters. Some believe that the earth caste of the enclaves has developed, in the careful way that Ovessa once worked, some technological means of extending his life. That he sleeps, perhaps, in the long stretches between his appearances, kept young by machines we have not been told the workings of. Others suspect the matter is simpler and harder than that, and that what we have been calling Farsight for these last centuries is in fact a long line of successors, each one taking up the name and the battlesuit and the bearing of his predecessor, so that what the enclaves love is less a man than a torch passed from hand to hand. And there are those, the most thoughtful of them, who suspect the answer lies in the carved sword he carried away from the toppled statue at Arthas Moloch, the Dawn Blade, as it came in time to be called, and in what that blade is, and what it gives, and what it asks for in return. None of these theories is proven. None has been quite ruled out. The records are silent. The enclaves, for their part, still stand. They have stood through the long silence of the ethereal council and through the wars that have come to them since. They are not the empire he was born into. They are something a little freer. The ethereal council does not write to them, and they do not write to the council, and the great gulf between the two sets of Tau, separated by the Damocles, and by all the years, and by the unhealed quarrel about what was said at Arthas Moloch and what was not said before it, remains as wide as it has been for a very long time. Whether it will narrow in the years to come, no honest chronicler can guess. What then, in the final reckoning, is he? He is not the hero the Empire raised its statues to in the bright years of the Reclamation. That hero was a kinder and simpler figure than the man we have spent these pages with, and the Watercast's careful version of him left out a great many of the things we have come to understand he was. He is also not the traitor the Empire tore those statues down for. That figure was angrier and more selfish and less devoted to the greater good than the man whose long life we have followed. The truth of him, so far as a single chronicler can perceive it, lies somewhere between the two. A warrior who loved his people very much, and who came to suspect that loving them required him to step away from them, and who did so at considerable cost to himself and to them. The Tau have not yet in the wider empire found a name for what such a person is. Perhaps in time they will, Perhaps the language for it has not been invented yet, and is waiting somewhere in the long workshops of the future, ready to be put into the mouths of Tau, who do not yet exist. One can only hope so. He deserves a better name than the one the Council gave him, and a more honest one than the one the Watercast gave him before that, and the duty of finding such a name will, in the fullness of time, fall to those who come after. There is a statue, still, outside the great battle dome of Montir on Viola. It was raised when he was young, and it was preserved through the years of his glory, and it was permitted to remain when the order came down to remove all the others. It stands now, by official designation, as a reminder of the dangers of stepping beyond the loving guidance of the ethereals. But the dawn comes early on Viola, and the first light of the great hot sun touches the statue's face long before it touches anything else in the courtyard. And there are mornings when an old veteran of one of the Sep's regiments will pass by upon some errand, and will pause for a moment in front of the statue, and will perform, very softly and very briefly, the hunter's salute that has not been performed in public on Viola for a very long time. He will lower his arm again afterwards. He will continue on his errand. The statue will go back to being whatever the Council has officially decreed it to be. But the morning will have happened, and the salute will have been given. And it will not be the last such gesture, and the statue will continue to stand. The amber light of a small reading lamp falls softly upon the desk, and the file closes.